This is Tokyo Real. I'm Ian Simpson, and with me today I have Keith Davies. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Good to be here. Fantastic location.
Yeah, and we're both looking a bit rough because we're not at our best because we just come out of the water after catching a few waves. So we apologise but anyway, that doesn't matter. What we talk about is the important thing. You are a rugby coach, professional rugby coach. You've been one of the top rugby coaches in Japan. You've been there over 30 years, and you're also coaching the Queensland Reds Super 15 team when they won the Super 15 title a few years ago. So you got that's been your life for the past 30 years. So let's start off with maybe talking about some Japanese rugby, because Tokyo Real based in Japan. We've recently had the Rugby World Cup. Japan have come out of it with probably their best result ever. What does this mean for Japanese rugby?
Well, I think short term, obviously at the moment it's created a boom. I think we have to be a little bit careful about how we use the word boom. I used the analogy quite recently of a boom versus a wave. A boom in my mind tends to be something that creates a rise, an awareness, and then that's followed by a continued either an improvement or following or whatever. The difference between a wave is that once a wave goes by, there's nothing behind it.
Right. Okay.
That's an important thing that sort of maybe something that we have to consider, that this might just be a wave as opposed to a boom. Undoubtedly the World Cup was a fantastic result for Japanese rugby. There was a tremendous amount of work that went into achieving those results by players, coaches, staff, leading into the World Cup, and obviously those results proved how much work they'd done. Whether the amount of work that they've done and the amount of training that they did, number of training camps, etc., is something that can be maintained again for the next 4 years. I certainly know of a few players who were in that setup before the World Cup who thought that they were overtraining or maybe doing too much, but
I heard that the Japan team before the World Cup had an incredible amount of training camps.
Yes. Unlike the majority of teams, Japan actually spent, I think it was over 180 days, half a year basically, in training camp down in the south of Japan, in Miyazaki, working on fitness programs, sometimes training 5 times a day.
Right.
Now, whether that, taking into consideration a domestic season and responsibilities as well, players who are now moving across to Super 15 rugby and overseas rugby as well, and whether those players are going to be able to do that over the next 3 years, because really by the time the next Japan coach comes in, it's only going to be 3 years before the next World Cup.
That's the point. The next World Cup is in Japan in 2019, so
yes.
they've got 3 years to build for that.
Yes.
So they'll appoint a coach soon, and he will obviously stay in place for the next World Cup if things go well, I guess. Yeah?
Well, the new coach has already been announced for the both the Sunwolves team, which is the Super 8, the new Super Rugby team, and the Japan national team. That will be Jamie Joseph, who's actually been in Japan before, so that's one good thing. The Sunwolves is actually being run by a coach who has no Japanese experience so far, has had a very mediocre coaching career to date. How long that contract's for, I don't know, but I would hope that Jamie Joseph, and his appointment, he's got a long-term one, so he can certainly build the way that Eddie Jones built with the previous
now
team.
Eddie's got a history with Japan, yeah?
Yes.
Maybe a Japanese wife, I think.
I think, yes, there are definitely relatives somewhere. I think whether it was a Japanese mother or wife, yeah.
Yeah, but he's been here a long time, so he understands the culture. And this often makes me wonder when they bring in what you might call famous coaches, or ex-players, because we've been in Japan a long time and we understand the culture, but you bring in someone to a new culture that is totally different from what they've come from. How effective can they be? They can't speak the language.
No. Well, again, yes, having to rely on translators and to get your point across using translators can sometimes be a bit of a barrier. I know that Jamie Joseph has spent time. He was up in Japan with a team called Sonics,
right?
And actually played for Japan because of the residency ruling that we have in rugby. If you're a resident in a country for 3 years. So Jamie has certainly got some Japanese experience and also speaks some Japanese. So that will be an advantage for him. The Sunwolves, in contrast, it's been a very, very short preparation time. They've only been training, they start the Super Rugby program next week. We're now looking at mid-February. We're in mid-February now, recording this. They will be starting on the 27th of February. Their first game. Very short preparation. They've only had one charity stroke training game.
Yeah.
So that's going to be a big challenge for them.
Well, you coached in Super Rugby and in top league in Japan. What is the difference level wise? What can they expect? What problems can they expect?
Well, I think one of the things with Super Rugby, it's true to an extent at all levels. In Super Rugby, in top league, what you need is a squad of 30 players who are all capable of playing top league rugby. Because the nature of the game is that you'll have injuries and forced layoffs and things like that. In contrast, of course, with Super Rugby, you need 30 players who are capable of playing Super Rugby.
Yeah.
If you have a squad of 15 players who are capable of playing Super Rugby, and then only 15 players who are capable of playing top league rugby, once you get those injuries and whatever kicking into place, your team performances will suffer.
Is this a fear with the Wolves that they don't have the strength in depth?
There are a few good players in there, yes, but the strength in depth and experience at that level is it's a very thin.
So if they lose a few key players, it could be a disaster.
Yeah, it's a very thin veneer that they've got. Yeah. And undoubtedly Super Rugby, because of the fast grounds that they play on, hard grounds, the impacts and the speed of the game, by default you will get those injuries. It's going to happen.
Yeah.
Every coach who's worked with a Super Rugby team knows that that's what they have to factor in.
The injuries in rugby seem to be increasing, the amount of injuries and the severity of the injuries seems to be increasing over the last couple of years. Why is that? Is that because of body sizes, or?
Well, a lot of it is actually to do. It's to do with the fact that playing surfaces are now a lot faster. They're a lot better prepared, so you don't have the muddy, slow fields that rugby players used to have to work with.
Yeah.
So you've generally got fast tracks, and you've also got players who are fitter. They're doing specific speed work. Their body fat levels, as they're more of an athlete now as opposed to a.
And they're training. They're weight training every day.
They're weight training every day.
The hits probably are going to be a lot.
Yeah. So their body weights are probably actually heavier than and bigger and whatever than players 10 years ago. But they're not carrying excess weight.
Right.
So the speed, the impacts, and also, of course, the fact that in Super Rugby, 1 week you could be in Perth, the following week you could be in Auckland, the following week you could be in South Africa, Japan, Singapore. So the travel, the turnaround, as we call it, from game to game, has to be very, very carefully managed. Rehabilitation, which is something that Japan is very, very poor in.
Yeah.
Looking after their players is something that any foreign players who've played or worked in Japan will know. Rehabilitation is backward. It's the only word for it. Whereas, and so all of those factors come into play when you're trying to get your best 15 or 23 players, including your bench, set to go on a Friday or a Saturday.
Yeah. Yeah, as you know, I've done a bit of coaching in Japan in the past, and it's always surprised me in the clubs I've been in how often the players are overtrained or overworked, particularly the day before a game. I wonder how much sports science is actually going into what's being delivered in the coaching programs over here.
Well, again, sports science tends to be something that it's this conundrum. It's the chicken and the egg thing, you know. I've tried to get sports science support into teams that I've worked in, and Japanese logic is that if we get better, we'll do that. We won't do that to get better, but yes, you can have that budget once we've won these games.
Yeah.
But how can we win those games is the first problem. So that's where you want your sports science support and whatever. The top league teams and whatever, yes, definitely they have that. They're getting that support in place now, and a lot of them are employing overseas coaches and strength and conditioning experts, and even bringing physios and whatever in from overseas. But certainly at the university level, which is the progression level down from top league rugby in Japan, the sports science and the let's say the organisational structures within teams are very, very poor.
So grassroots level rugby in Japan, how do you feel about that then? Below the university level?
It's barely changed from what I was seeing 30 years ago. Oh. It's still an attrition-based sport.
Yeah.
There are still high schools that are training 4, 5, 6 hours a day, playing a ridiculous number of game time minutes on any particular Saturday or Sunday on a weekend. It's basically an attrition sport. And that causes them problems later on when we look at injuries and those compounded injuries that they get later on.
Yeah. Talking about some basic sports science, I know that you use NAC Sport for video analysis, and I've going around the rugby circuit, spoken to some high school coaches and university coaches, and some of them don't even use video analysis, which is a pretty basic form of sports science. Yeah.
Well, one of the reasons I originally started to use video when I've been using video for many, many years. I was one of the first people anywhere to start using it. But that was because I was in Japan. I was basically in a scenario when I was trying to get my message across to people who didn't really understand what I was saying. And we have this, you have that sort of cliche that a picture tells 1,000 words.
Yes.
And in video, it was more for me as a way of trying to communicate with players and get past that initial language barrier that I had, even though I now speak Japanese, that I initially had with players. But again, how teams are using video, it can be a very negative kind of approach that some coaches take.
Yeah.
Players, if they see that the video becomes a negative only.
So the way you feed it back is really important.
The feedback method is very important. Yeah.
So what did Japan have to do over the next 3 years to be successful in the next World Cup?
Well, that's an interesting question, because Japan, as the hosts for the next World Cup, basically have two challenges. One is to be successful as an organising country, as a host nation. And the other is obviously from a performance viewpoint, from the players and the coaches, the on-field performance. So those two actually lead you down two different paths. When Japan organised the Soccer World Cup, it was an astounding success from a marketing and an organisational viewpoint. Whether the Japan Rugby Union and the people in control of that can actually bring that off for the Rugby World Cup is something that I really do worry about.
Yeah. Is it a bit of old school Thai approach at rugby in Japan?
Well, I don't think that still rugby in Japan is seen as a business, as a going concern. What it's seen is still the emphasis is on rugby in universities. And it's controlled by old boy networks from the universities. It's still very, very amateurish in the way they make decisions, and there's very little forward planning. It all seems to be reactive from the Japan Rugby Union, and there's very little turnover in the personnel, the people who are working in the organisation at the top. So that there's no new blood going in, no new thought, and that's typically a Japanese organisational setup.
It seems to me from a lot of the foreign coaches I've spoken to over the years who come in, they tend to get very frustrated in that although they are the head coach and they're put up on a pedestal, things aren't always done the way that they want them to be done, or at least they are for a while, and then they go backwards a little bit.
Well, I mean, that comes back to the performance side of things, and as a coach going in somewhere, going into a new team, this is actually one of the things that Eddie Jones recently said. Every 3 years, a coach should be looking to move on to a new team or start something different anyway. So really, as a coach, what you're trying to do is achieve something in 3 years, 2 years if possible, where you get to a certain level, and in the third year you reap the benefits of all the work that you've done. And that was the way Eddie planned. In my view of things, that's the way Eddie Jones planned and achieved the results that he did for the Rugby World Cup. There were some mediocre performances in the middle of their preparation, where maybe players were tired and things like that. But the use of the sports science and all of the backup that Eddie Jones created within the Japan team meant that they tapered off at the right time. They had players that looked fresh, even though they had a very, very difficult Rugby World Cup schedule, having to play Scotland within 5 days of their first game against South Africa. But that's key. That sort of stuff is key.
Is it hard to make change in Japan? Though Japan, whether it be in business or rugby, traditionally is very set in its way.
Well, that's the thing.
It's hard to bring about change, I think.
The frustration comes from the fact that you come in, and the first 6 months for you as a coach, trying to set standards, change culture, trying to improve a team, get results and whatever. As a coach, personally, I feel those are the first 6 months are the most important time. Because people are looking within your organisation to get fresh ideas from you. But when you want to implement those fresh ideas, and you have a wall put up, a barrier put up, and say, well, that's not the Japanese way to do things, or that's not the way we do things, then you start to think, well, why am I here? What am I here to do? Then, unfortunately, you get some coaches who will just sit back and say, well, if I'm just hitting my head against a brick wall all the time here, then I'll switch off also. And you end up with people just taking it easy for the next sort of 18 months and whatever. I personally don't do that, but I know of some coaches who would definitely have taken that approach. And it's not good, of course, because it means that we're not really making progress anywhere. And that comes back to what I was just saying there about the on-field side of things, the performance side of things. If Japanese players as a whole can be tapping into new techniques, new coaching, new methods, sports science backup and things like that, we create a much bigger base of standard level players, which will create our next level of top league able players, and then our Super 15 able players, and of course on top of that, national team players.
Yeah, a bit like Australia and New Zealand, I guess, where from little kiddies, grassroots level, they're going through a system that has been thought out from how they will progress to the All Blacks team or the Wallabies team. It's all set out from kids, Whereas in Japan, it seems to be rather destructured.
Well, again, that's by necessity. I think one of the key things I always say about rugby in New Zealand and Australia is that both countries basically have a minuscule rugby playing population compared to the likes of England or France or even the USA, for example, which is now going through a boom period. Japan certainly. So those two countries have to be smart with their playing and their methods and their sports science backup. I mean, New Zealand always appears to have a conveyor belt of players coming through, top quality players, and certainly players who can play at what we call NPC level, the next level down, or Super 15. but it's not an endless conveyor belt. New Zealand is also having to compete now against soccer and parents thinking about other sports. So where you have those smaller populations playing rugby, you have to be smart with how you play the game and approach the game, how you market it and also how you retain players to the game.
Yes.
One of the biggest problems that Japanese rugby has is that they can't retain players after they leave university at 22 years old.
There's a massive dropout rate, isn't there?
There's a massive dropout.
They finish university.
Yeah. Whereas
for us, I think, rugby was always part of our life. You would never think about giving up rugby. I mean, we'd be playing now if we didn't have so many injuries, probably.
Well, exactly. I mean, it's sort of, you grow up with it in your blood. There are very, very, lots and lots of club competitions and whatever, with players running around all ages. Whereas in Japan, you have a massive drop-off at 22 when players leave university, they go into a company, and they basically never play rugby again.
No, I find that amazing.
It's incredible that, particularly when you have some positions in rugby, for example, 25, 26, where props, for example, might be peaking.
Yes,
they come into peak at that age instead of 18, 19 years. So they're at their physical peak when they're 26.
Yeah. And a lot of them are retiring at 22 when they enter a company. And the reason is, I don't have enough time.
Exactly. And even top league players, the top league players are still working with companies, and the next level down, the top east, for example, the top west, the next leagues down from the top league, players there, some players in those teams don't start training until 8:30 at night.
Yeah.
Finishing at 10:30, 11 o'clock at night after a full day at work. And they're the next level down from top league players.
Yeah.
So the base is very, very narrow.
Yes.
And that doesn't bode well for Super 15 development and also national team development.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, the Japanese national players, international players, are more of them likely to be going overseas to play in the future, do you think? To get experience?
Well, certainly after this World Cup now. Prior to this World Cup, there were 2 or 3 players that were looking to that had played overseas. Horie, the hooker, and Tanaka, the halfback. Now we've had a few more players going overseas. One, Gorumaru, has just come to the Reds in Australia. There's some have gone to England. But I think a lot of the Japanese players that went to the World Cup were hoping that the Sunwolves organisation would be better.
Right.
So that they would be able to stay in Japan and play for a Japanese Super Rugby franchise. But when the announcement of the coach became delayed, the organisation of the team became delayed, there were no announcements about staff, and to be honest, the appointment of staff became so haphazard. There wasn't a real systematic approach to appointing staff.
Right.
I know that personally.
Yeah.
When that became the case, then those players started to think, well, it's not going to fall into place properly here. Why do I want to stay in Japan? I want to go abroad and get the experience there. And I still think personally that if the Sunwolves don't do well this year, you'll have even more players next year wanting to move offshore and go and get the experience that's necessary to come back and help the Japan national team in the next World Cup.
So could that be beneficial for the national team?
Oh, personally, I think yes. Yeah. I mean, obviously players like Tanaka and Horie, they've had fantastic, gained fantastic experience from being overseas the last couple of years. Yeah. So.
Yeah. Well, let's hope that the JRU get it right over the next 3 years, and we could be successful in the next World Cup.
Yeah. Well, the potential has always been there. It's something that I've spoken about for. I mean, although I first went to Japan coaching 30 odd years ago, it was my very first job out of university, going into Japanese rugby to coach. It's certainly been, not all of my career has been in Japan, as you say, Regs rugby and European Cup rugby with teams in Europe. But
potential's there.
The potential has always been there, and I've always said that. But unless things change, potential is just potential. It's just this word out there.
Yeah.
You know, to get to your potential, any athlete or any manager or anyone in any business or whatever will tell you that you have to do things to reach that potential.
Yeah.
And that's always been a problem with Japanese rugby, and it still is.
Yeah.
It's still one of my biggest worries, the organisational structure behind it. But we can hope.
Yeah.
And if there's a strong character in Jamie Joseph coming in to take over the national team. Eddie Jones was also a strong character. So I can only hope that like Eddie, Jamie can stand up to the Japanese Rugby Union, get things in place, not just for his national team, but for support teams coming through and players coming through in the development programs as well.
Yeah.
We have to hope that will happen.
Well, let's keep monitoring it, and you're on site a lot of the time. We often meet up, so please come back on the show. And
yes, anytime.
We'll keep updating and talking about this stuff. Now, you're on as a guest today, but I know you're going to do some co-hosting for us at some point.
Yes.
In English and some Japanese interviews,
yes,
which will be great for our viewers, especially the Japanese viewers.
Yep.
So thank you for that.
Yep.
We look forward to it, and thanks for coming on today.
Well, at the end of the day, it's Tokyo Rule, so we want to try and get some of this information out to Japanese listeners.
Of course, build up our Japanese viewers.
Yeah, so great. Thanks for the invite.
Thanks, Keith.
Good to see you.
And don't forget, Tokyo Reel is sponsored by The Edge Performance Analysis Solutions. Give yourself the edge.
More waves out there, we got to go.
Sorry, let's go.
Back then when life was easy